Perfect. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all to Dorsey and Whitney's webinar on generative AI, basics, pitfalls, and best practices. I'd now like to introduce Charlene Krogh, a partner in Dorsey's trademark group. Charlene?
Thank you. Gina, you can go to the housekeeping slide, please. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Good morning, if it's your morning, good afternoon, if you're joining, and it's the afternoon. We really appreciate you attending this discussion on generative AI. A couple of housekeeping things on the slide here. As Lori just mentioned, the materials were emailed to you. The recording will be sent in the survey after the presentation. We have opened the chat, which some of you have already found. Time permitting, we'll try to answer the questions kind of as we go through the content, but we certainly may not get to all questions. Feel free to reach out to us. Our information is in the slide deck to me, Amy, or Gina. CLE code will be announced in the middle of the presentation. CLE is expected in a number of states. And don't forget to return your completed attendance form, please. So by way of introduction, you already heard I'm Charlene Krogh. I'm a partner in Dorsey's trademark, copyright, and brand management group. Gina and Amy sit in the patent group. Gina is a partner and Amy is an associate in that group. They both practice in a wide variety of technical areas, which include machine learning, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, software systems, virtual reality, and others. In addition, all three of us work in the open source software space and in the mergers and acquisitions, licensing and transaction spaces. So,
we found, it's kind of a weird combination of like this cool copyright and trademark lawyer with two kind of patent nerdy people, but we found especially in open source and in this new generative AI space, having kind of technical technical expertise mixed with copyright experience is kind of the key to having kind of successful counseling and guidance on this.
Yes, and as you'll see in this presentation, in order to have extremely well-rounded guidance in generative AI, you would need your regulatory attorney, your privacy lawyers and cyber lawyers, and possibly others. But we're going to do our best today to give you a very good foundation. We all have heard stories, untold numbers, some humorous, some unsettling. The potential applications for generative AI are numerous, untold. And the technology in its current form, I think, is being touted as game changer, right? We've all heard this. It's villainized as the death of professions, and it's growing very quickly, rapidly, without much transparency and without any regulation, really, although we're starting to see that happening. So we could do an entire seminar devoted to just the technology, just intellectual property, just data and privacy, regulatory. But our hope today with this outline is to really give you a good overview, a good foundation, level set for some of you, identify and discuss some of the use cases, benefits, and risks, and then really talk about some considerations for best practices. It's not going to be every best practice or every consideration. We're going to try to really give you a broad understanding. So for some of you, this could feel too introductory, but we're hoping it's going to be a really good foundation for most people who are on the webinar. And just so everyone knows, to the extent this impacts your desire to stay in the webinar, we will not focus on the service provider side of GAI. We'll focus on the user side, and we won't really explore in depth the data side and web scraping and things on the service provider side. So just
we also will not be covering kind of the existential threat to the lawyering practice as a whole. So that's
or humanity as a whole. Yeah.
No,
so whole nother presentation. We'll try not to make you cry today. So that's our outline. Go ahead, Gina. I'll hand it off to you.
Okay. Thank you, Charlene.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start off. We thought it would be good to kind of have a baseline to describe for those who maybe are a little bit confused or just generally kind of set the stage of what artificial intelligence is. So artificial intelligence is basically kind of algorithms that can analyze data to kind of learn or classify types of data. So I kind of we have a cat theme, as you will soon find out throughout this presentation. Image classifiers will review a bunch of different types of images that typically, in some instances, will have some data tagged with it to say, this image contains a cat or this image does not contain a cat. The algorithms will then analyze and they'll start to identify patterns to determine whether an image contains a cat. So for example, it'll look at a bunch of different types of images. We'll figure out, oh, hey, in all of the cat images, there's some pixels that form, the shape of ears, eyes, and a nose. It will start to kind of correlate those shapes with a cat, and then can be used to analyze, to answer the question of, hey, in this new image you haven't seen before, does it contain a cat? And it will look for the patterns that it has previously reviewed and detected to determine whether the image actually includes a cat. A lot of kind of conventional AI is more niche and tailored. So it can answer, does this picture include a cat? But it can't answer just, hey, AI, tell me what is in this picture. That's kind of free form of a prompt. Additionally, conventional AI requires training that's based on the expected input. So kind of conventionally, you have to say, I'm going to ask you whether an image contains a cat, and I'm going to provide training data to you on that. And then it can answer that specific question. So it is a lot more kind of narrowly driven. And you'll see
Alexa, play for me this song. That's sort of more conventional AI.
Yes, and it has heard that it has a library of that song. And then you'll see through here, we've created some fun images using some Gen AI systems. So here's our cats playing poker in Vegas. They don't look that serious though. So machine learning, this often kind of is grouped in with AI. In fact, I kind of think of it as a kind of a subtype of artificial intelligence. I think the big difference kind of from conventional AI to machine learning is that machine learning can identify patterns, for example, the cat image pattern, without as much human oversight to describe to the AI system of what it should be looking for to identify a cat. So for example, with machine learning, you're going to feed it a bunch of images and it's on its own going to say, hey, in about 25% of these images, they all have the same kind of triangular shape at the top, the ears, the eyes, and a nose. And it will say, it may not identify that those are a cat, but it may identify those as kind of representative of the same object. The interesting thing with machine learning is that it will kind of often generate or recognize patterns that are not kind of provided by the humans. So it'll use statistical models and other kind of assessments to identify patterns in the data. And again, it's kind of analyzing data and then saying, hey, these things are similar or they're not similar.
And I would only add, Gina, that until recently, machine learning was largely limited to predictive models. And because there's such a huge amount of data now, the potential for machine learning has just kind of skyrocketed.
Yes, exactly. So now we turn over to generative AI, GAI, as we'll kind of use throughout this presentation. So I think the biggest difference, and totally kind of pun intended, is generative AI is called that because it can generate new content. So continuing with the cat theme throughout, the big difference with GAI models is that you would ask it to draw you a picture of a cat versus asking for it to identify whether an image contains a cat. So it is actually creating new content based on the data. So it will look at a bunch of images, for example. I have identified that these features all correspond to cats. It will then, if you're asking it to draw a cat, will pull in and kind of recreate those same features, those geometric shapes, to create a cat. I don't know, maybe this is kind of cat-like type of output. I do think, and it does fall under kind of the broad category of machine learning because it is kind of doing the same assessment. It is looking at different types of data and recognizing patterns. It is just taking the next step of then, recreating those similar types of patterns and data in a new way. The algorithms that can be used on almost any type of data, so audio, code, images, text, and video, it's doing the same assessment. We've given the image example. It would be same for text, same for code, and same for audio. It can then, basically at the core, recognize patterns and kind of create new outputs based on that same thing.
All right, so I'm going to go a little more in depth onto some different types of generative AI. As Gina mentioned, I am a nerd, so I will try not to nerd out too much and go into too much detail here, but I can't promise anything. So this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about large language models, which have kind of are the thing that has seemed like it's come out of nowhere. And there have been language models in the past. And so the whole large language model thing is an outgrowth from language models. So original language models are all trained on some corpus of text, and the corpuses were often limited to some particular application. And so they're trained on this corpus of text, they get a prompt, and then they generate something by looking at the patterns that are present in that corpus of text. These large language models, as the name would suggest, are a lot larger, and they're trained on a lot more data. The ChatGPT is trained on essentially the entire internet, which is part of what gives them, including Reddit, which we'll talk about a little more, which gives them this ability to then be flexible across different applications. So when these first came out and people were, asking it to write Shakespearean sonnets, it could do that. It would get the meter correct. It would get all of those types of things correct. It can write code. It can talk conversationally. All of these things because it's trained on all of this data.
And Amy, we have one quick question from the audience. This is not specific to large language models, but there is a question of when we're talking about GA models as a whole, if they're trained on both words, images, or both. I think often it can be both. It can depend on the type of model.
It depends on the data set the model's trained on entirely. If it's just text, it's just text. If it's text and audio and video, it's both. If it's images, yeah. Go ahead, Amy. Sorry.
Yeah, so essentially, being trained on all this large amount of data just gives it the flexibility. And as you'll see a little bit more from our prompts later, you can ask it very specific things and it will tailor your output based on the prompt pretty closely. So this is kind of a bucket slide for your edification. So you can just categorize all of these models that you've probably heard of into what types of generative AI they are. And we're going to go a little more depth into each of them.
And this is not all encompassing.
Yeah, this is not exhaustive. There's new models popping up all the time. But this is the ones that we had kind of seen the most of and that may have been in the news most.
Yeah, and I think the other important thing is to see, as we mentioned, but it's, there's ones for image generation, code generation, music composition, video, design and art. I mean, these are really the full gamut of different types of content.
And I would say with regard to this slide to think about as we progress through the material here is if you work in a company that has a lot of different titles and roles in it, for instance, you're going to have people asking for all different types of access to GAI based on what they want to do, right? They're writing copy, if they're writing code or something else, or creating images. So there's a ton that they may need. Also, there's a lot more than just this, and they vary in how well they're actually prepared and created.
So we'll start with our text generators, and this is obviously where our ChatGPT falls in. A lot of these, another big, leap forward is that they use natural language prompts, which means that non-technical people can start to interact really closely with this model because there's not a whole lot of formatting that needs to be done. The model on the front end will parse whatever natural language input is given to it and deduce semantics, context. It can deduce formatting, all of that kind of stuff from this prompt that's written in natural language. And then just quickly touching on what next token prediction means. These models, what they're really outputting is some they're using statistics to try to figure out which words are most likely to be next to each other given your prompt. And this is an important distinction to understand between a search engine. So what you're not doing is searching all of the data that it's trained on. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind for reasons that we'll talk about later. And just can we go just a second? Just a quick, aside on what we're talking about with being able to get context from the prompts. So we have in this image, the first one asking to write a story at a 5th grade level. And the next one, the same story to college graduate level. And if you peruse those later, you'll see that it's done a pretty good job at distinguishing between those two. So those are the types of things and part of the power of these models. And so next we're going to talk image generators a little bit, continuing with our cat theme. And this is just kind of to underline how important the prompts are. So on the left, we asked it to create a cat as a hero flying over Denver. And on the right, a superhero cat flying over Denver as digital art. So as you can see, it's changed up the style. It's changed up the style of the city, what the cat looks like, all of these kinds of things. So the important thing in image generators is that it can mimic particular styles and particular styles of particular artists, which again is a little preview into later. So that's part of the power of these generators. And often they use, as you can tell from our prompts, they also use natural language prompts.
And the other helpful thing is to easily create fun images for your presentations.
Yes. And software code generators, it's debatable whether they're a separate category, but I thought useful to discuss as an aside. ChatGPT can be used to generate software code as part of the fact that it's trained on so many things, but there are other models such as Copilot that are trained more specifically just on code to generate code. They can be used to generate individual lines of code, routines, which really can speed up the coding process. They can support multiple types of programming languages. So you can ask it, like here we asked for a Python script, gave us a Python script, those kinds of things. So, and it's trained, the Copilot and the software specific models are trained on all types of code that's made public, some of which are associated with various types of open source licenses, to give you another preview into later.
And this is where I need my technical people like Amy and Gina, because Amy starts saying words like Python and I'm like, yeah, that's a for me. That's is that software, is that code? So I'll jump in here. Benefits of GAI, probably from what you've already seen, from what Amy described in the different types of software, you already know some of the benefits, and you've already heard them in the news. You know, the production of music, the deep fake that came out, I'm sure you're all aware of. But the primary benefit, if you had to synthesize it, is efficiency and time savings, which equals increased productivity. I think the other one is increased creativity potentially and innovation. So some businesses, like marketing businesses or sales-driven companies, they've quickly added generative AI use cases into their workflow already because of the speed and scale, right? They can bring content production and customer relation management efforts up to speed very quickly. Other industries, I think, that have more legal and compliance hoops to jump through, like regulated industries, healthcare, insurance, education, have been slower for obvious reasons. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, primary benefits, they accelerate work products. So can summarize research, medical research, let's say, even texts, large chunks of texts. They can kickstart the creative process, which I already mentioned. They automate repetitive tasks. And then I would say they're used for improvements on existing AI. So Gina talked about chatbots for a minute. And I think the old chatbots, which existed, because AI has existed for a very long time, as we all know. We're just talking about this new generation of generative AI, have now come into using predictive text, right? So it's improving on existing AI. And then there's a couple of other things here, but one thing I would mention is just the ability to analyze large unstructured data sets to identify patterns and anomalies. I think that's also something that a lot of companies have found to be a major benefit. This list could be probably 5 or 6 pages long, frankly. This is to give you a sense. So you know the benefits. So let's talk about a bit of use cases. And this is primarily, I think, one to crystallize for folks on this webinar why everybody wants to use this in their work, not just in their home life. Like, oh, I want it to create a meal plan for me from Monday through Friday, right? Like, that's great. but why do all the employees want to use it? Why do people want to use it in their work product beyond just efficiency? So what are the real use cases here? So text generators, you can generate copies. We're talking about advertising companies, maybe consulting companies who create social media posts, blog posts, folks who create websites, things like that.
I mean, there's so many types of just kind of routine copy that is used.
Yes, absolutely. Summarizing data, business intelligence. You can think about this. So you use it on a GAI system on your own data set that can help you analyze your own business data to drive performance information and other business intelligence, right? Can help you compose emails and letters, can help lawyers prepare legal documents that can get you in real trouble, as we've seen with some case law recently, or with some cases recently. Can auto-generate customer service responses, automate customer service workflows, generate and send marketing communications, on and on and on. Image generators. I have clients who are using or thinking about using these platforms for mood boards, right? Seems like a really good use. Creating artwork for branding, that's tricky. People do it though, and are doing it. Content, lists of ingredients. If you're a food company, for instance, and then software code generators to speed up rote tasks, help write code or pieces of code. I would say a couple other things to mention that I'm not checked out to actually discuss in detail because it's not what I do, but I've heard use cases for fraud detection, of course. So summarizing large amounts of data, identifying patterns and anomalies, right? So there we go again, to look for fraud detection or to look for fraud, and then employment. So there, you could do a whole seminar on the use of GAI in the employment context to do performance evaluations, look at data related to an employee's performance, solicit feedback, provide feedback, and then craft performance evaluation. So just a couple other things. And then graphics and audio, you could eliminate the use, right? The need for your own actors, for instance, or your own AV, and make a process much quicker. So
you would never do that for your own lawyers, though, just to be clear. We're indispensable, I believe.
You would never replace your lawyers with GAI.
Never.
No. So these again, this could be an entire slide deck on its own, but it's intended to really get folks on this webinar thinking about all of the different use cases, because I think one thing that Gina and I have heard that we really want to make clear here is people have started to approach policies and how they're going to manage use a lot like open source software. And it's very different. It's the same in some ways, but it's different in some ways. And this potentially impacts every title in an organization, not just code, software developers.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gina.
All right, so returning to the tech, our technical limitations here, which are going to, I guess, inform kind of our legal limitations. The two biggest things, and I guess the biggest theme, is that a lot of the limitations are based on the data that is used to train the model. So it's the old like garbage in, garbage out thing. We have to keep in mind what type of data is being used to train a model. And like Gina said, there's data being scraped from Reddit, which if you use Reddit, you might understand the implications of that. All sorts of online forums, people's opinions, people's thoughts, those kinds of things. So our two biggest things I think to keep in mind technically are accuracy and bias. So the accuracy is kind of an ongoing problem, which academically is the hallucination problem, which means that this generative model is just coming up with something that sounds really good, but it doesn't exist. And I played around with this a little bit and like, can you provide a technical paper about this? And it says, yes, it was written by Dr. So-and-so. And then you go and Google that doctor and they don't exist. They're not at that university, never have been, but it sounds very accurate.
You fact checked, Amy, unlike that one lawyer who used it for case law research and then asked ChatGPT to confirm its research and it said it was fine. And it was completely made up cases.
Yeah. And then the bias also that it inherits, which is an ongoing problem, but because it's being trained on so much data, written by so many people, it can inherit those biases. So I think that the bottom line here is to make sure that you check what comes out, no matter how good it looks, because it could be wrong. And that's just one of the technical limitations to keep in mind. The other thing is that the output of the model is really dependent on the prompt. So similar, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't write a prompt specific enough, it can give something that's not useful, not quite what you want. I think a lot of people have kind of figured this out by, intuitively learning how to tailor their prompts to get out what they want. But it's also important to know, especially for kind of the rote tasks, that the output could be variable between users based on how experienced they are with the model and what kind of prompts they're providing it.
Yeah, kind of throw back to the different kind of super cat images that were created.
We do have a question that says, are we aware of any work being done on sorting out authoritative quality of data sources, algorithmically or otherwise? I am aware that OpenAI is doing some work to tighten up hallucinations and the accuracy of data, but there is that I'm aware of, and this is just me, it's someone else maybe, and if you are, please write to us in the chat. I am not aware of anyone trying to, for instance, like fact check or source check information that's in a data set, right? That it's regurgitating or using to create the next prediction. So Amy talked about technical risks. I'm going to just talk about the kind of general risks of AI that are maybe not technical. And then there is this section on this slide about technical limitations, which Amy kind of already spoke to, so I won't dive in there. So the general risks, there's the one at the top here, which I think is making headlines and everyone's aware of. It's the privacy and misuse, right? So one, generated content may violate privacy and publicity laws, but there's also, because it's taking data, images, voices, other things from online and creating content based on it, people are using that content. So there's violation that happens there, but there's also the risk of poor development in the actual applications, right? So that in and of itself creates security and privacy risks. So there's a lack of proper procedures amongst a lot of the technology and platforms on how the data is collected, how it's used, how it's dumped, which creates concerns aside from the content it's generating. So how it's getting that content, the data and how it's using it. And I would say potential for deep fakes is one that most of us have probably already become aware of. There's been several published issues with this, and I'll point to a couple just to put a finer point on it. So in Australia, voice print program is used by the government in Australia to allow access to their self-service accounts for information. And in 4 minutes, someone trained a GAI model to create a fake voice that was tricked the voice print system in Australia and allowed a user access to a secure self-service account. So that was 4 minutes of training. And then another example is in the UK, an energy firm CEO thought he was interacting, and this is real time with voice, with the CEO of the German parent company and released $300,000 in funds because the deep fake of the CEO's voice was so real and so perfect. This happens with images too, of course. Another thing to think about is, and Amy mentioned this with the cat slide, with the superhero slide, is as people use the systems more, they come to understand that the prompts and the use of good prompts is what gets you really good output and the output that you need. So as employees or companies or others start to learn this, their prompts divulge more and more confidential information or business information or private information to get better generated output back. And as that happens, there's a risk of sharing more and more information. And I'll say here that I looked this morning and Cyberhaven did some research, and this was in, I don't know, March, I think, of this year. So the numbers have probably increased. But at that point, they said 11% of data that employees pasted into ChatGPT, which is just one system, as we all know, is confidential. And 4% of employees have pasted sensitive data at least once into ChatGPT. So it's happening.
And one thing to highlight here is that a lot of these ones, let's take ChatGPT as an example, are kind of configured in a way to be able to be circumvented from the typical like IT constraints in kind of company devices. So for example, if you were to download a new program, you typically need like an IT administrator to, approve that download onto your computer. A lot of these ChatGPT, for example, is just browser-based. So you just create a login. And so users can access this without any real control from the organization. And so, we've even heard of kind of one company that over GAI use was not permitted by the company, but they wanted to test kind of how many people were accessing it. Over a 7-day period, they had over 1,500 unique hits, global firewall hits on ChatGPT. So that is a ton of unique access to just one of the types of GA models. So there is just a ton of usage that's happening out of these. If you think your employees aren't using it or accessing it, it's not, you are kind of mistaken. I mean, perhaps some of that use is for their own personal, creating their meal plans, but there is a lot of use.
And we'll talk about legal risks next, and we're going to talk specifically about confidentiality, trade secrets, and IP a bit. What we're not going to discuss really is regulated industries, but healthcare, insurance, education, others. But I think there are other legal compliance issues and hoops for those regulated industries that have to be considered. And then HR bias. The other thing I would say is employment risk, right? General risk of HI is if you're using GAI in, for instance, hiring on the employment side, as Amy mentioned, there are inherent risks of bias in the data and in the system. So you have to be very careful about violating laws and rules if you're using it for those purposes.
And then Charlene, we had a quick request to restate those statistics, and I'm assuming they meant the statistics for
Cyberhaven
confidential data.
Yeah, so the Cyberhaven stat that I have from, which is a little dated now, but not super dated, is 11% of data that employees paste into ChatGPT is confidential. And 4% of employees have pasted sensitive data at least once into ChatGPT. So I hope that's what you needed
too, but
yeah, I think it's low now.
I promise at the end, we're going to give you some tools. I feel like we're just in the shock and awe stage. I promise there will be some light at the end of the tunnel about what to do now that you're all scared about what your employees are doing. But let's go through a couple more of the potential legal risks in more detail. As Charlene noted, we're IP lawyers, so we are focusing on the IP aspects. There are a ton of also, other areas of law that may be impacted, because this is a Dorsey CLE, I'll plug, talk to your trusted Dorsey advisor for other types of non-IP related GAI issues. So one kind of the big infringement risk with respect to IP is, as Amy noted, a lot of these GAI models are trained on open source software. So this is software that's, posted on the internet, for example, GitHub. And you can use it as long as you include often like an attribution to say, hey, this was created by this person. That's called a permissive open source license, very typical. These models are trained with it. When they generate code based on this kind of use of the underlying software, however, and generate, the new code output to a user, the attribution doesn't travel. So that results in effectively kind of a breach of the license agreement. And if you have breached the license agreement, you may be considered to be having copyright infringement by your use of this generated code because you didn't comply with the attribution requirement of the license. And that's, we gave the example of code, but the same would be applicable for audio or content or images. Other things where there is a license requirement for use of the underlying data, that license isn't complied with in kind of the new generated output. There's other claims based on again, the data sets and what the permissions were or how that data was, actually kind of retrieved and used and whether that was proper. So there's other types of claims. I think a big issue just generally for different companies is you have a lack of control. You have no knowledge where or how this generated output came from. So you may have this output that was, based on a data set that was kind of improperly taken from a competitor. Now you've used it inadvertently, but you've used it to generate your own kind of work product, and that can be particularly problematic. And then maybe one kind of farther afield, or I guess to be tested areas on your own kind of IP, there could be created an implicit license. So for example, let's say you have a patent that covers kind of a high level method of doing something. You're then using ChatGPT to create the actual software to kind of implement that model. And you're providing ChatGPT this information in the form of prompts and other data. And that is then like, being freely used by ChatGPT to output kind of similar solutions to others. Because you provided it freely, it could be considered an implicit license for the kind of patented technology. So there really is just a lot of problems on the IP side for infringement. Another big issue is trade secret and confidentiality lost. Charlene and Amy both talked about it, especially with that statistic on the 11%. But most of these models right now can and do retain user data for further training. So this not only includes the prompts that are being provided, but the data, the suggestions, and other algorithms that are being used are all kind of going back in to make the model better and more sophisticated. But these models are retaining this information. And because they're retaining it and using it to provide others with similar answers or generated content, you can actually have this information output to your key competitor in the form of a prompt or an answer, which then clearly is problematic. So let's say you're working on a niche solution, you're asking kind of very specific prompts, you're providing very specific data. The model is going to take all of that, and your competitor down the road is asking a similar thing. They don't have as good of data, but the model now has that and can provide kind of a better solution than it would have otherwise. And you've also kind of perhaps waived any coverage you had to trade secret or confidentiality over that data by use of the models.
And I would add, Gina, so Amy's going to talk in a minute about some lawsuits and the outcome, or I'm sorry, the impact of some of those lawsuits and other investigations, like for instance, by the FTC and others, is that some of the license terms for these models have changed so that they're not allowing inputs to be used for further training. But what we can also say is the license terms are changing like all the time. So I'm not sure we can rely on that to be the future. And there are still many models who are allowing the data for training. They are almost all allowing it for improvement of systems, but some no longer allow it for further training, just because I know if I don't say that, someone might mention it in the chat as something to point out.
That doesn't sound like something lawyers would do. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, actually protecting your own IP that may be generated with some, help from GAI tools. So on the patent side, currently right now, inventorship, there is a requirement for human inventorship. Inventors must be individuals, and individuals has been determined to mean natural persons. However, I think the USPTO is being pretty pragmatic and practical about this, which is unusual for them maybe. The use of the AI system as merely a tool by natural persons doesn't preclude the people from qualifying as an inventor. I would say in most cases, especially right now, that kind of the solutions that are being generated with these tools are kind of being used as really a tool, and so aren't being kind of listed as inventors. They wouldn't preclude patent ownership, or I guess the ability to file for patent protection solely based on the use of the GAI as a tool in the kind of development of a new method or solution. There is kind of the conventional patent challenges with respect to kind of all types of software solutions, which is, whether it's an abstract idea or a typical subject matter eligibility, which those in the patent space would understand as kind of applying kind of broadly, irrespective of whether it was GAI created or not.
So on the copyright side, to date, the office rejects registration of works created using AI technology if they were created with AI technology on the basis that authorship in the act excludes non-humans. So a work of authorship requires a creation by a human being. The influx of applications created that at least partially used AI to create a work of authorship has resulted in the need for the Copyright Office to provide some guidance, which it issued in March 16, 2023. So the guidance is posted here, but it says what matters is the extent to which the human had creative control over the work's expression and actually formed the traditional elements of authorship. And then the office gave in the guidance these two examples. So when AI technology determines the expressive elements, the output, the work isn't protectable, but when the human being selects and arranges the material in a sufficiently creative way, then it can be protectable. The guidance also indicated that you have to disclose the inclusion of AI generated content. And in the author created field, you have to provide an explanation. But I think overall, when this came out in March, it created like a little bit of a flurry of activity, but overall, it doesn't change the underlying rule that works have to have elements of human authorship for registration, which I think Gina is kind of the same on the patent side, right?
Yeah.
I think it's just people maybe weren't thinking about it a lot more before because they weren't using machines to create content in the same way they are now. It wasn't proliferating. And so there have been registrations of works already, of course, some of which you probably heard about that have, for instance, human generated text and machine generated images. So that is the guidance the Copyright Office issued, which I think was well timed and helpful.
Yeah, and we got a question kind of on what our thoughts are on the creative control as applied to kind of the prompts. I think that applies also to on the patent side of the, how much is this being really used as a tool versus, solely on its own inventing things. I'm going to give the lawyer answer. I feel like it really is going to depend on how those prompts are generated and be kind of very factual dependent about how that goes. I think maybe ultimately that'll be considered to be enough, but it will, I think, depend on, again, how much of creativity and uniqueness was provided in the prompts itself. And I just want to note, we got a question on some of the training, the tools, some of these different tools have some terms of service that may provide some assurances on confidentiality, and this is where we can address this issue. Yeah, so terms of service, if we're talking about ownership of IP, which is this first bullet, and there's more that we're going to discuss than just this on this slide, but if we're talking about ownership, there's kind of a few different iterations. So one is it provides ownership of the output by the user, right? But the underlying sort of issue there is whether the returned output involves third-party owned IP and to what extent, right? So between you and the system, you may own it, but between you and third parties, there's still a lack of clarity, right? Some provide for ownership by the platform, and then some provide for ownership by the user, but with a very broad license to the platform. And there was a comment in the chat about the license, allowing for the maintaining of confidential information and the filtering abilities in some of the terms of the actual applications, and then the relevant terms of service around those. And I would say, I read not that long ago some research around, and this was related to Copilot, but I don't think it's limited to Copilot, that there are a lot of filters you can use to, only use open source licenses of a certain kind, or limit sort of confidentiality in how input is used. And it's a contract. And as we all know, it's words on paper, but if the service provider isn't adhering to those terms and that information or that term is breached, then your confidential information can be used or is an output or maybe is used to train the system. So I think there is a lot of unknowns. And what the research showed was that at least for Copilot in this particular instance was that the filter didn't work. It was still returning other licenses. So I think there's a long way to go. I talked about this earlier, but the security and the how well the application was built itself is still a problem, right? It creates risks. So having terms of service that address all of your potential issues is not where we have to stop. I think it is the application itself well built? How can we check that? Can we get the third party sort of testing results? Can you have access to that, and how would you do it? And the other thing I would say is the terms of service are rapidly evolving. And Amy's, again, going to talk about this, I think, in the next slide, mostly somewhat as a result of feedback, but also as a result of lawsuits.
So I would say, don't read the terms of service once. Read it when you have to click through to accept it again, and keep up to speed on it, because it won't be the end of the story.
Especially if you're going to be using it for kind of key code generation or other kind of important output, make sure you're really assessing this and probably having, a thoughtful discussion with the teams that will be using it and how the content will be used to make sure it's sufficient.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't know why we went away from the cat theme here, but this is a nice stern owl.
Well, owls, eat cats, or so don't they pick them up and prey on them? I don't know, small cats. So maybe we're still there. I went into the dark side there, but sorry, I was going to say we also lost my train of thought because of owls and cats. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, that's pretty common. This is all right.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current legal landscape, and as Charlene said, these kind of three pieces of it are all really interdependent. So the terms of service, like she said, are going to change based on the outcomes of these lawsuits or various controversies that are happening between sites and their users, and companies changing their policies. All these three are going to kind of feed off of each other, so it's important to keep an eye out on all of them. So as far as lawsuits go, I'm not going to go too deep into the facts of each individual case, but as a theme overall, we have lawsuits alleging the unauthorized and improper use of proprietary data for training. And so we've had artists who in this Midjourney lawsuit have said that the fact that the model is generating art that is in their particular style, which we kind of mentioned a little bit before, is copyright infringement. So they're concerned about their art being used as training data there. In terms of Copilot, we have the group of coders who have said that their code snippets are being used to train the model, and have similar issues there. And then Google has gotten themselves in some hot water in California, based on this scraping of data that they're using to train their models. And then we've had, go ahead.
Sorry, Amy. So these are not exhaustive either. We're just trying to give you examples because this is also changing, I would say, on a month-to-month basis, but they're the usual suspects that we would expect, right? When a new technology is launched, it's security, it's data, it's IP, privacy, and then a few other things thrown in there, but the usual suspects.
And then in terms of non-lawsuit issues, they are still kind of centered on the training data and the data that's available to the model. So this Reddit API issue has been kind of a big deal if you're more in the know with Reddit. So their API used to be free, and now they're starting to charge for it because they've realized they have this kind of treasure trove of data that can be used to train all of these models. And that's causing a lot of friction between Reddit and its users. And so it'll be interesting to see how that comes out. And then, of course, we have the FTC investigation of OpenAI, where they're trying to kind of get a better handle on, what this model is, how it's been trained, what kind of data has been using to train it, whether this is personally identifiable data, and things of that nature. So that outcome will certainly affect licensing terms in the future.
And Gina is a prolific user of Reddit. Sometimes, we're all dying to ask her how she feels about this Reddit issue, but we don't have time.
I didn't even know that there was like a separate API I had just assumed people were using the Reddit app, which I have learned is not the case. So anyway, I'm obviously not that sophisticated of a user.
Even Gina can learn new things about tech. So now that we've appropriately laid groundwork for the tools, how they're used, all the benefits, why everybody around you is already using it, even if you're not, and I'm kind of joking there, and all of these risks, let's talk about what we do next, and the considerations for controlling use, allowing use, perhaps, but controlling it, tracking it, and then thinking of forward, thinking and looking ahead. So one of the ideas here is the considerations for company policy around use. So this, again, think about your open source policy. If you're a company that uses a policy or uses open source for development, you want to strike a balance with any policy. So the balance is between allowing use that makes sense and that has risk that is manageable for a company or for an individual, but balancing that with the need for the company to be able to track who's using what, or be able to secure its own data and confidential information, and control basically the use. I would say when we're talking about a company policy, I've talked to a lot of clients about this. What I have seen not work very well is when you just have a lawyer team trying to develop a policy. I think what you need is to involve key stakeholders from your organization, from all of the different business units or roles, and the leadership for those roles in the input. So what are the use cases for every single title? Get the input from the stakeholders, and then create, I think this works well, a bit of a task force, right? So this is going to be the people who launch it, who are available for questions. Again, you need people in each business unit because you don't want maybe legal potentially answering very specific questions about software development, or about marketing and website, social media posts, for instance, right? If you're talking about use cases. So you need a bit of a task force and then training. I think training is key. Unlike open source policies, this policy is not going to be launched to a group of people who are tech savvy potentially. Open source policies are generally reviewed and used by developers. They understand, they know what software development means and how to do it. So they understand the policy more. So along with the launch of a policy, what we have seen work best is training that is hand in glove with that, and continual training.
Yeah.
And here,
I was just going to say, Charlene, one of the things that Charlene and I have done when we've kind of worked with clients to develop these policies, we come in, do a training, we talk to, work with the in-house legal department to talk to the different business people, and then create a first kind of draft, and then, have that vetted with the business heads to make sure that makes sense. But as Charlene said, the training is really, I think, key for people to understand why they should care and why this is important.
Yeah. And before the policy and during policy creation and even after, I think the companies have to continually reevaluate the risk assessment, and it's going to be different based on the industry. If you're a marketing agency, the risk profile is different than if you're a bank. A defense, you're a company who works in defense systems, software systems maybe, or military or insurance, right?
Yeah.
So a constant reevaluation there, and then research into the companies who are launching the platforms, I think is critical. So evaluate the security risks. Your IOPS team can maybe help with that. Review the privacy policy and security features of these things, of the applications. So on this slide here are some ideas and sort of typical considerations for a policy. So you want to talk about when the use of GAI is allowed and when it's restricted, and then what inputs might be allowed and restricted, and then how you use the output that's coming from the GAI, and types of use cases. So we have a few examples here, but at the very bottom, permitted use of GAI, we've seen a lot for brainstorming and idea generation. We have seen a lot of software code development allowed in a lot of policies with enterprise licenses, for example, with Copilot, and then research and analytical purposes, but always with review of the output. So we caution companies a lot to train employees to think about the output from a GAI system for certain purposes, like a Google search, and that you wouldn't just use it and say, oh, this must be true, right? Because it's coming from the internet. You would actually fact check it, look for source, things like that. And then this, go ahead, Gina.
Oh, I was going to say one note is, and this is based on a question, but there are often different kind of permissions based on not only the type of work product, but also businesses. So marketing may have a more kind of free reign to use a GAI than you would your software development team.
Yeah. And we have seen, again, the risk profile and managing it is going to be different for every company, but we have seen companies say, you cannot use image generators. You can't use them because we're not sure what the output is, but we have seen them say, use image generators all day long for mood boards, right? Or for an internal use or something like that. So they differ. Is what I will say. And then another consideration for a company policy, this is both in the policy, but also a practical matter for a task force and for tech in a company, is the tracking of use. So I would require internal tracking and disclosure. So employees should be disclosing when their work product was created or facilitated by use of GAI and how. Why do you want to do this? So one, regulatory compliance. Again, we're not going to jump into that. Document use for IP protection, right? So your copyright application, if you want to register something that's been created, you need to be able to identify for the office and for yourself and in an enforcement action who created what and using what tools. Document use for future transactions and reps and warranties. So if you are a startup company and you are going to sell in 3 years, you're going to need to be able to make a rep. The software you've created is owned by you. And if it was facilitated using GAI, you're going to need to disclose that. And you're going to need to have a business practice around it so you can actually speak to how and when you use it.
And creating a schedule of which code has been generated. And again, the similar kind of approach is open source.
Yeah. And then compliance with customer agreements. Some of them may not allow technology like this. It might not say generative AI, but it might say something that could restrict the use of GAI. There are other ethical considerations here, right? If you're working in an industry with actors, media production and content, right? There's a lot of discussion right now around the use of GAI. For instance, to create an overdub if someone didn't get a line just right using a fake voice. And then as we progress, your customer agreements are going to have terms that are directed at this. So you will need to comply with those terms. So how do you track it? So you need to create a document trail and a disclosure when it's used in work product, require approval for use. So a little bit like an open source policy, your policy may have a whitelist of a particular GAI, and then it may need approval. We are seeing a lot of clients and companies who are requiring approval for any use, so they can just track who's doing what. I think that's a good idea for the moment. And then make the outputs traceable. So tag them potentially if they're used in work product. And if they're saved on a central system, make sure it's clear to everyone who has access to that system that they were generated using GAI. I talked just a tiny bit about this when on the last slide. Sorry, we're right at 11. But the unique challenges in transactions, right? So if you're a software company and you're selling, you need to be able to represent and warrant that you own a material piece of software, for instance, that creates a lot of value in a transaction. And the only way to do that is going to be able to track how GAI was used to create it. And this applies to any content, but I'm talking about software specifically. And then to create and show that there's a business practice around it in the form of likely a policy, and then it's followed. And if it's not followed and you have repeat offenders, how you manage those issues. The other issues, of course, that are unique are breach of the data sets, trainings, confidentiality and trade secret disclosures and things like that would also be relevant in a transaction. Sorry, go ahead, Gina. I was trying to.
Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry, we're rushing up against the time, so we'll just kind of have the key takeaways. GAIs are useful, can add efficiencies. Your employees are probably already using them, so it's important to implement policies to think through them and then track the use. I think this will be kind of key for going forward. I think these tools are going to be more and more integrated. So you definitely want to be flexible and think long-term. You don't want to be the only company that's not allowing such use, because it is going to provide a lot of efficiencies. So you just need to have a policy and think through how that use is going to be kind of permitted and tracked. And then, again, think of the contractual provisions, both on terms of service and other things that could be implemented to allow kind of the use of GAI. So thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. Hopefully you found it informative, or maybe at least got a little bit of humor out of our cat and owl themes. Please, if you need the credit, return the completed sign-in to the attendants at Dorsey. Questions, please feel free to follow up with any of us. I know we would be happy to chat more. And anything else I'm missing?
That's it. Yeah, please email us. I know we didn't get to a lot of the questions, so we'd be happy to chat more, continue the conversation.
Yeah, we're also just super fun people. So obviously that makes a big difference.
We're losing them, Gina. They're going.
Oh yeah, they're dropping off, dropping like flies.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.